Right, let me start now then. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Rachana Srestha. I'm Public Management Specialist in Asian Development Bank, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this webinar on a very important and exciting topic, the subnational government finance and investment. And we have a panel of experts from OECD, from United Cities and Local Government Asia Pacific chapter, and also Department of Finance, Bureau of Local and Department of Finance Philippines. So we will hear from them on the third edition of the World Observatory of Subnational Government and Finance. OECD will present that. We will also hear the Cities Enabling Environment Rating from Dr. Bernardia from the UCLG ASPAC, and we will hear country case study case from our Executive Director, Mr. Nino Raymond from Department of Finance Philippines. And sorry, from OECD, we have Courtney Willer, who will be presenting on the third edition of Subnational Government and Finance. Then we will start with an opening remarks from ADB. I would like to now request Mr. Bruno Carrasco, Director General, concurrently Chief Compliance Officer, Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department, Asian Development Bank, to deliver the opening remarks. Over to you, Bruno. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachana. Distinguished colleagues from the OECD, United Cities, Departments of Finance, and ADB, and participants, a warm welcome to all of you. I'm very much delighted to join you today to share some thoughts on the very important topic of subnational government finance and investment. Subnational governments, of course, play a very important role in delivering important public services across many areas, including health, education, social protection, water supply, and many others. Subnational governments also play a critical role in very important areas. More widely, we also know that the Sustainable Development Goals are strongly rooted in the ambition level and absorptive capacity across subnational governments. About 2/3 of the 169 SDG targets involve subnational governments. They also account for nearly 1/4 of total public spending and more than 1/3 of public investment. Education, social protection, health, and other public services are the primary areas of subnational government spending, and these are closely linked, of course, with the SDGs. However, the reality is that subnational governments face enormous challenges in undertaking their mandates, including access and mobilizing financing, both through such things as transfer systems, typically from the central government, and through own sources of revenue. And of course, they also face stretched institutional capacity limitations. The latter, of course, is very much linked to the former. Enabling subnational governments to overcome the barriers to mobilize more revenues and access finance calls for a multi-pronged and integrated approach. I'd like to share 3 messages. First and foremost is the importance of creating and fostering an enabling environment at the national as well as the subnational government levels. Let me look at the country national levels first. It is, of course, important to ensure that in preparing national frameworks and institutions to support subnational government finance, these operational frameworks must be coherent and consistent with one another. For that, it is important to avoid perverse incentives and perhaps even undue discretion. It is also important to translate these frameworks and policies into clear operational guidance. Further, fiscal decentralization with clear demarcations of responsibilities and authorities of all government tiers is another important element. There is indeed a stark reality that many central governments, especially in lower and middle income countries, decentralize fewer revenue sources than what is required in terms of subnational mandates. This is also known, of course, as the reverse balance. Of course, it is also understood that with the limited capacity at the subnational level, accountability has to be well accepted before central governments have the assurance of being able to release greater funds, given fiduciary and other concerns. Central government should therefore consider delegating more revenue-raising fees to subnational governments with appropriate legislative and institutional frameworks, and concomitant with strengthening of absorptive capacity at the subnational level. For this reason, there are many mechanisms in place where transfers are linked to performance results. Our subnational programs at ADB focus strongly on developing institutional capacity through our technical assistance programs. We also recognize that this capacity development strengthens the overall development impact. In addition, at ADB, through our Asia-Pacific Tax Hub, we stand ready to assist developing member countries to define their domestic revenue mobilization goals and strategies. At the local level, for example, much of our effort focuses more and more on developing property tax. Turning now to the subnational government level, we recognize that while subnational governments in high-income countries raise about 30% of total public revenues, their counterparts in low-income countries raise roughly less than 8%, and despite the availability of a range of subnational own-source revenues. Even where subnational governments can raise their own revenue, these are often underutilized, again, reflecting the weak institutional capacity. Further, poor resource planning and public investment management, characterized often by a disconnect between development plans, investment projects, and budgets, remain a critical challenge in many subnational governments. Therefore, they lack a pipeline of viable and costed projects, and this inhibits the ability to attract further private investment. Moreover, due to inadequate fiscal frameworks and weak financial management systems, they are often unable to mobilize financial resources from commercial sources. Second, infrastructure investment, of course, requires long-term financing. So subnational borrowing, again, is crucial. Subnational government borrowing is relatively limited in many countries, and the bulk of it is in the form of loans rather than bond financing. Studies show that subnational debt accounts for, on average, 14% of total public debt, but in many developing countries in Asia and the Pacific, the percentage is close to zero. Promoting subnational borrowing in developing countries will require the adoption of policy reforms, including important governance reforms, to strengthen local public finances intended to improve the fiscal capacity and creditworthiness of subnational governments over time. PEFA exercises at the subnational level are important means to strengthen the enabling environment. Some form of partial guarantee facilities and backed by central authorities can also represent a means to develop greater discipline in this endeavor. Finally, turning to my third message, enhancing subnational development finance must be tailored to the country context. Moreover, as highlighted, adequate attention and support must be provided to strengthen the institutional capacity of subnational governments, as this is key for them to be able to adopt innovative funding and financing mechanisms, including, again, private sector participation in investment projects. ADB, of course, is committed to supporting subnational governments of our developing member countries, and we have been providing various support, including policy advisory, as well as the earlier mentioned technical assistance. This includes, of course, a successful e-learning program on decentralization, local governance, and localizing SDGs for the last 3 years. Finally, in closing, before I end my remarks and hand over to my OECD colleague, Dorothy and Dupre, who I've had the great pleasure to work with over the past few years, I would like to acknowledge the great partnership between OECD and ADB in this important area of multi-level governance. I'm also pleased to note that our ADB colleagues are working closely with the United Cities and local governments, Asia Pacific chapter, in advancing the localizing of SDGs agenda. Thank you very much. Back to you, Rachana.
Thank you so much, Bruno, DG Bruno, for your insightful remarks. You highlighted on creating an enabling environment at national and subnational level, and we noted your emphasis on the importance of institutional capacity of subnational governments, including development of appropriate fiscal frameworks and robust fiscal management capacity for them to be able to adopt innovative funding and financing instruments. So thank you so much for this. I will now request Dorothy Dupre, Head Regional Development and Multi-Level Governance Division of the Center of Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities from OECD for her opening remarks. Over to you, Dorothy.
Thank you, Rachana, and thank you very much, Bruno. I'm delighted to take part in this webinar on this important topic, and I would like to thank very much the Asian Development Bank for organizing this seminar and for the great partnership indeed on multi-level governance issues that we have with the ADB. I would like to thank the ADB also for the close cooperation during the preparation of the third edition of the World Observatory on Subnational Government, Finance and Investment that we just launched on the 24th of October this year. The World Observatory is a joint project between the OECD and UCLG with a number of key partners like ADB, and the observatory started in 2017. I would like to thank also UCLG ASPAC for all their inputs in the preparation of the last edition. The World Observatory is today one of the world leading source of internationally comparable data on subnational government structure and finance. I just would like to highlight 3 points before Courtney presents the key findings of our analysis on the Asia and Pacific region. So first, we know that achieving the SDGs depend on progress made at the local level. Bruno has mentioned it. We know that at least 105 of the 169 SDG targets will not be reached without proper engagement of subnational governments and coordination across levels of government. Indeed, subnational governments have key responsibilities for public services that relate to the SDGs in housing, community amenities, social protection, education, environment, and so on. Subnational government also play an instrumental role in infrastructure investment. They're responsible for almost 40% of public investment in Asia and the Pacific region and 60% in G20 countries. But subnational governments do not act alone. Most of these responsibilities are shared across levels of government. Hence, the importance of focusing on this enabling environment that Bruno mentioned. Implementing any public policy linked to SDGs and effective public service delivery require effective cooperation across levels of government. And for this to happen, a strong understanding of challenges related to multi-level governance and fiscal framework is needed. And this brings me to my second point, which is that reliable and comprehensive data are needed to better understand multi-level governance and fiscal frameworks. The DNA of the OECD is to collect and produce data to support evidence-based policies. That was the raison d'être of the creation of the World Observatory that we often call WOFI. The objectives of WOFI are to bridge the fiscal data gap and to facilitate access to standardized, reliable and comparable data on subnational government structure, finance and investment across the world. And for the last edition that we just released with the precious help of the ADB and many of its country desks, we were able to collect a large amount of information on subnational government across Asia and the Pacific. The 2022 edition of the WOFI covers 26 countries from Asia and the Pacific, 5 federal and 21 unitary countries, encompassing a total of around 467,000 subnational governments. All the data is publicly available on the Observatory's website, and I think we can share maybe the link on the chat later. And finally, and this will be my last point, the World Observatory is not just a massive global data collection effort. It is instrumental in providing the evidence to support the global agendas linked to the SDG, the recovery from COVID, the climate change, and so on. And the WOFI has, for instance, supported the development this year of a policy toolkit on mobilizing funding and financing for inclusive and quality infrastructure investment in regions and cities, focusing on G20 countries. This toolkit was developed by the OECD with support from the Asian Development Bank. And I'm very pleased to report that it was endorsed by G20 Ministers of Finance in October and by G20 leaders just last week in the G20 summit in Bali. The subnational infrastructure agenda is critical in the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and is gaining prominence in global discussions, and the WOFI is instrumental for this. It's also thanks to the WOFI and the collaboration with ADB that we have been able to prepare the joint report that Courtney will present in a minute, which aims to provide a comprehensive picture of subnational government across Asia and the Pacific. So we hope that this work will provide a valuable contribution to the debates around the implementation of SDGs and effective public service delivery in the Asia and Pacific region. I very much look forward to the discussions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. And yes, very pleased to hear that our partnership has, has been very good, because we not only work together in this third edition of the Subnational Government Finance and Investment, we also put together this very interesting, I will say that this very good policy toolkit on mobilizing funding and financing at the subnational government level. Yes, definitely, I would encourage everybody to really visit this subnational government World Observatory data, because it includes data from 135 countries, which covers almost 90% of the world and 93% of the world population and 94% of global GDP. So it's really remarkable, and very happy to work together on this very important knowledge product, I would say, which is a fundamental, as you said, to increase the understanding of challenges there are at the subnational government's level. And without understanding those challenges, it would be very difficult to create that enabling environment that you and both Bruno emphasized in your remarks. Now, let's hear from Courtney Willer on the findings of this very important third edition of the World Observatory. And his presentation will mostly focus on the situation of the subnational finance and investment in ADB's developing member countries in Asia. So over to you, Courtney.
Thank you very much, Roshana, and thank you to you, Bruno and Dorothy, for your great opening remarks. I think what you mentioned aligns very closely with the findings of the analysis that I'll present today. So that's great to see. As mentioned by the earlier speakers, and before I get started, I just wanted to note that the analysis presented today has been undertaken using data and country profiles from the third edition of the OECD UCLG World Observatory on Subnational Government Finance and Investment. I encourage you all to also look at the website, as Dorothy and Roshana suggested. It's very valuable and useful resource to have on at everyone's fingertip. It's a public good, so please make use of it. A synthesis report based on the global findings from the World Observatory analysis will be published in the coming weeks on the website. And a separate report with the information that I'll highlight today on Asia and the Pacific will also be published soon. Now let me jump into this presentation. Next slide, please. Over the last 4 decades, many countries around the world have undergone multi-level governance reforms to improve their institutional, territorial, and public management frameworks. This is often translated into reforms that have devolved powers, responsibilities, and resources to subnational governments. Asia and the Pacific has followed this trend, and today it is home to around 2/3 of the world's subnational governments. For the analysis in this presentation and report, we studied 26 countries across the region. Of these, 21 are unitary and 5 are federal. 5 are least developed countries. Put together, they represent 53% of the global population, 24% of the world's land area, and 40% of global GDP. Within these countries, there are around 467,000 subnational governments. These include 627 state or regional governments across 24 countries out of the 26 countries. This level of government is much more common than other world regions. It also includes 4,960 intermediary level governments, which is a level of government that exists in 12 countries. There are around 460,000 municipal governments, although around 57% of these are located in India, which does skew this number somewhat. 12 countries were also found to have an additional sub-municipal level. These are municipal administrative subdivisions that may have budget and some responsibilities, but no self-governing powers. Indeed, the existence of these sub-municipal layers is much more common in Asia and the Pacific than in other world regions or OECD countries. It's a unique thing about Asia and the Pacific. By contrast, very few countries in the sample included have only one level of subnational government, which is much more common in the OECD, although we did exclude some small Pacific countries from this analysis which may have one level of government or which have one level of government. The region also has many asymmetric arrangements, much more than in other world regions. These asymmetric arrangements give different responsibilities to regional or local governments at the same level. They often exist in capital cities or major metropolitan areas, for example. Asymmetric federalism also exists in 4 out of 5 federal countries. Next slide, please. The size of subnational governments varies significantly across countries, which can have important implications for public service delivery, regional development, and investment. 3 countries have state or regional governments who represent, on average, populations of over 30 million inhabitants. These are Pakistan, India, and China. Regional governments in most of the rest of the countries represent populations of under 5 million people, with regional governments in Bhutan representing only 40,000 people on average. Geographically, there is substantial variety as well, with Australian states being an extreme outlier. Looking at municipal governments, we see that 3 countries have municipal governments who represent more than 200,000 people: China, Korea, and Malaysia. Municipal governments in 12 other countries represent over 10,000 people, and in 11 countries, they represent less than 10,000 people on average. There's also significant geographic difference in the size of municipalities. Next slide, please. Many countries across the region have recently undergone decentralization and territorial reforms. Institutional reforms can facilitate decentralization processes. Recent examples of these include in Indonesia, where villages were recognized as self-governing entities in 2014, Nepal transitioning from a unitary to a federal state in 2015, and Kyrgyzstan engaging in a process to recognize a new self-governing district, which should come into effect in 2023. Alongside institutional reforms, many countries across Asia and the Pacific are changing their territorial structures through amalgamation or petitions. Amalgamations refer to the union of municipal or regional entities into a single entity. These are often undertaken to further gain from economies of scale, increase the capacity of subnational governments, improve economic competitiveness, and enhance access to finance for investment. In Armenia, for example, 4 ways of amalgamation have taken place since 1995, with the aim of increasing the efficiency of self-governance and public service provision. This has divided the number of local communities by 3. Amalgamations can sometimes be a difficult way to undertake reforms for various reasons, and countries sometimes prefer intermunicipal cooperation, although this is much more common in the OECD than it is in Asia and the Pacific. Petitions are also occurring. These usually respond to a wish for better catering for the specific needs of an increasingly large population, or with specific policy preferences. In Uzbekistan, for example, the central government created a number of new districts since 2017 and is planning to increase their number by further creating new intra-city districts and rural districts. Next slide, please. At a regional level, many countries across Asia and the Pacific have seen a strengthening of their governments over the past 70 years. According to the Regional Authority Index, regional authority has doubled in Asia and the Pacific from 5.2 in 1950 to 11.7 in 2018. Most countries in the region, like India, Indonesia, or Japan, exhibit a trend towards more decentralization. There are some interesting cases, such as Nepal, whose federal constitution made their score jump by almost 10 times its initial value. Some other countries, such as Thailand, have seen their regional authority drop in the last few years. Next slide, please. As a result of decentralization processes, subnational governments now represent an important share of public expenditure and revenue. Here we find subnational governments in the Asia Pacific are responsible for 29% of total public expenditure, around the same as in the OECD and much higher than the global average of 21%. We also find that they receive 35% of total government revenue versus 34% in the OECD and 26% globally. I should note here that all figures include averages from other world regions and other country groups within the region. LATAM, for example, represents Latin America, CWA represents Central West Asia. All is the sample of countries that we're examining today. All averages included in this are unweighted, I also should note. While the two figures here indicate an important level of decentralization, it is relevant to note that many subnational governments have less fiscal autonomy, as they may act as a paying agent for central government with little or no decision-making power, or may have limited revenue autonomy. Next slide, please. Now, looking at the proportion of subnational government expenditure by functional classification, we find that almost a quarter of subnational government expenditure is for education, while 22% is for general public services, 17% for economic affairs, including transport, and 10% for housing. The proportion of expenditure for education in grey is above the world average of 20% and in line with the OECD average of 22%. The proportion of expenditure for economic affairs and transport in yellow is 17%, which is higher than both the OECD and world average. Economic affairs expenditure is even higher as a proportion of total government expenditure in China at 35% and in India at 31%. Next slide, please. We can also look at the relative role of subnational governments in each classification of the functions of government. We look here at 12 countries with data available. Darker green boxes in this chart indicate higher spending responsibility. For the countries shown, we see that subnational governments have the primary responsibility for expenditure relating to housing, community amenities, housing and community amenities, with subnational governments representing around 70% of total public expenditure in this category, and environmental protection, where they represent around 50%. They also have a significant role for public expenditure on education, recreation and culture, health and economic affairs, including transport. Although there are important variations across countries. In New Zealand, for example, subnational governments have no public expenditure classified as education or healthcare. In Australia, public order and safety is mainly a state government responsibility, unlike most other countries. Next slide, please. Moving to investment, here we find that subnational governments in the region are responsible for almost 40% of total public investment, which represents almost 2% of GDP. The role of subnational governments in total public investment on the y-axis is below the OECD average of 47%. The ratio of subnational government investment to total public investment on the x-axis is well above the world average of 1.5%, and also above the OECD average, reflecting a high level of investment in the region. Subnational public investment varies from almost 0 to almost 90% and 3% of GDP in countries like Kazakhstan, the top middle of the chart. Next slide, please. Now, looking more broadly at budgeting processes, we find the emerging use of participatory budgeting and priority-based budgeting, such as green budgeting and gender budgeting. In Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, for example, the central governments are experimenting with participatory budgeting at the subnational level via pilot cities and districts. In India, green budgeting has been developed with various state governments, such as in the state of Odisha, who use climate budget tagging. Next slide, please. Subnational government revenue across Asia and the Pacific is mainly composed of grants and subsidies and tax revenue. Like most other countries, this is like most other countries. Although in Asia and Pacific, the proportion of user and charges and fees is relatively low at 7%. Approximately 48% of revenue comes from grants and subsidies in orange, lower than in the OECD, where it represents 53% of revenue. Approximately 40% of revenue comes from taxes in blue, higher than in the OECD, where this represents 33% of revenue. This could indicate that Asia and the Pacific is more fiscally decentralized, as there is lower dependence on grants from upper level governments, although it is not quite this simple. Next slide, please. It is certainly true, as you can see, that Asia and the Pacific stands out when it comes to tax revenue. Subnational government tax revenue accounts for over 21% of total public tax revenue in Asia and the Pacific, representing 3.5% of GDP. This is much higher than the world averages of 14.5% and 3.1% shown in yellow. Nevertheless, in Asia, a large proportion of subnational tax revenue is made up of shared taxes with no or limited subnational government taxation power. The ability to raise own source taxes remains limited in many countries. In other words, larger tax values or larger values of tax revenue cannot be interpreted as a direct equivalent of higher levels of fiscal decentralization or autonomy. This indicates that fiscal decentralization is still limited in many countries due to these shared taxes. Next slide, please. There is one specific tax that is sometimes considered local by excellence. This is the property tax. Revenue from recurrent property tax represents around 26% of total subnational government tax revenue, which is lower than in OECD countries, where it is around 36%. However, there are some exceptions. In Georgia, for example, it is the only subnational tax. This is why we can see Georgia at the value of 100%. In New Zealand, it accounts for 83% of revenue. Although this tax represents over 1.6% of GDP in China, Japan, and Australia, Asia and the Pacific is below the OECD in terms of the percentage of recurrent property tax as a proportion of GDP. Property tax appears to be relatively underutilized. Next slide, please. Subnational governments often have a higher share of public expenditure responsibilities than their share of public tax revenue, which indicates a fiscal imbalance. Here we find that the average on both measures for Asia Pacific is fairly similar to the average for the OECD. In Asia and the Pacific, subnational tax revenue accounts for 21% of total tax revenue, but the subnational government expenditure falls to around 28%. Countries that fall below the dotted line are countries where theoretically one could say that there are fiscal imbalances. Next slide, please. Now looking at debt, we can find that subnational government debt is relatively low in many countries with data available, and many countries do not have data available. It typically represents less than 10% of total public debt and less than 10% of GDP, or much lower. Although there are some exceptions, including New Zealand, Japan, Australia, and China. It is also interesting to look at subnational government debt as a proportion of total subnational government revenue, which is a ratio that is sometimes used as a borrowing rule for subnational governments. In 4 countries, subnational government debt is above 150% of revenue. These tend to be countries with less stringent borrowing rules, higher institutional capacity, and more developed financial markets. Overall, these charts indicate that subnational government borrowing is very low in many countries in the region. Next slide, please. Subnational government access to finance across Asia and the Pacific is often limited due to strict borrowing rules and low creditworthiness. In about 12 of the countries studied, subnational government borrowing appears to be not permitted or to be only permitted through public financial institutions or ministries of finance. We identified 4 countries where it was not permitted and 8 countries where it was only permitted through public institutions. Other common borrowing rules include borrowing being limited to local currencies, restrictions on borrowing from capital markets, restrictions on the amount of borrowing, borrowing being limited to investment purposes through the Golden Rule, although we do find that this rule is less common than in OECD countries, even though it's generally considered as a good rule. Beyond borrowing rules, subnational governments face other constraints, including low levels of creditworthiness, limited bankable projects, underdeveloped local financial markets, insufficient institutional capacity, insufficient funding, including own source revenues and other resources, and other factors. Next slide, please. Many countries across Asia and the Pacific are placing the reform of fiscal frameworks and financial management as a priority, which is essential to accompany decentralization processes. In Cambodia, for example, the subnational budget reform strategy for 2019 to 2025 focuses on reinforcing budget policy linkages and enhancing fiscal balances. In Indonesia, a 2022 law aims to ensure transparent and accountable intergovernmental fiscal relations, as well as strengthen regional fiscal capacity and the assignment of central and regional government expenditure. Next slide, please. Now, before concluding this presentation with some policy opportunities, I'll quickly highlight some key data in relation to the effect of COVID on countries with data available. The scissor effect was strongly pronounced in the region, with revenue from taxes and user charges declining by 5.6% and 11.6% respectively, while expenditure increased by 7%. These effects were stronger than in other world regions. Interestingly, subnational government investment also increased during the COVID crisis by around 6%. Next slide, please. Now, finally, to point to some preliminary policy opportunities based on this research. These include to balance the fiscal, political, and administrative dimensions of decentralization, to ensure responsibilities are clearly defined across layers of government and are sufficiently funded, to enhance coordination mechanisms and support cross-jurisdictional cooperation, to make the most of intergovernmental transfer systems and harness a balanced basket of revenues, including assets. In addition, if we look at the next slide, these include supporting the effective use of debt by subnational governments, building institutional capacity, considering adopting priority-based and participatory budgeting practices, and improving the collection and transparency of data. Next slide, please. I will conclude this presentation here by quickly thanking the ADB team for the great collaboration and for their review of the country profiles that inform this work, and to my colleague Charlotte McKellen-Isabel for this joint effort, and of course Dorothy. I hope that this provides useful insights for the upcoming discussion, and look out for the upcoming report. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Courtney. This is really very interesting. I mean, you have shared a lot of information. We will share this information with all the participants later. The presentation we will share that presentation too. So though Asia Pacific seems so more fiscally decentralized with high public expenditure responsibilities, we noted that there is a high fiscal imbalances exist and that own source revenue remains low, particularly the property tax, which remains below 1%. It's also astonishing to note that there exists very limited subnational borrowing responsibilities or authority for subnational governments. So now we will turn to United Cities and Local Government of Asia Pacific. Our very own Dr. Banadia, the Secretary General of UCLG ASPAC, will share with us the Cities Enabling Environment Framework, which is very interesting, which actually rates different cities in the countries, and they are actually rated based on various indicators. So we now have this report actually, which we can share with the team, with everyone. So let's hear from Dr. Banadia as to how our cities are doing in terms of their enabling environment. So over to you, Dr. Banadia.
Thank you very much. Thank you also, Rachana, for inviting me to this meeting, and of course to OECD for a very good collaboration we have on this, what we call it, SNG-WOFI. Sounds cute name, WOFI. And also thanks to ADB for our good cooperation that we have over the years with the production of VLR for Jakarta, as well as the VSR, Voluntary Subnational Government Review for Indonesia, and that both have been included also in the VNR of Indonesia. This one of the aspects that we have been doing together as part of the cooperation in terms of localization of SDGs. What I'm talking here, basically in the few slides, show what UCLG ASPAC is about. But since I know that everybody knows about this organization, I will just quickly go through this, the three slides that started in the second slide and then third and fourth. Maybe in the next slide, it's heavy rain here. I hope you can hear my voice clearly. So it shows the organization. This cover more than 24 countries and has an office here in Indonesia at the City Hall of Jakarta, actually. And then and the next slide, it shows what actually the in terms of activities that include peer-to-peer learning, knowledge engagement, policy briefs, and this of course relate to advocacy, capacity building, as well as knowledge management hub, and also promote more about decentralized cooperations in the form of city-to-city cooperation or local government to local government cooperations. In terms of vision, we are the united voice and advocate of democratic local self-governments that promotes cooperation. And one of the things that we do is on the localization SDGs that we have been working in Indonesia as well as in Pakistan under this local empowerment, advocacy, and development for SDGs that is done in 2 provinces in Pakistan. So in the next slide here, show the vision of the organizations. Basically, we want to have a very strong and effective democratic local self-governments in the whole Asia Pacific regions. And of course, this is also the same goal that the UCLG Global has, and also ensure the effective political representatives of local governments, as we are also the major stakeholders on local authorities at the United Nations system, and promote economic, social, cultural, vocational, and environmental development, and also several other things that we include as a vision. So this is the next slide, shows what actually enabling environment ratings. This is a part of assessments that allows local governments to actually benchmark themselves against the minimum standards required for cities and local governments to contribute significantly to effective management of urbanizations. So why this E rating started? Actually, we would like to create a public debate related to enabling environment available in 30 countries. We did in these 30 countries. And also see what actually conducive environments that available in certain countries, and also have a productive, sustainable, and inclusive development. But what overall objective is basically we would like to see that in the place in the countries where the enabling environment is so strong, then we can also see the performance of local governments, local authorities, cities here also very high. So this basically to help local authorities determine action at the national levels, and also we want to see increased effectiveness in urban management. And EE rating in the next slide actually is done by local governments themselves in the country, plus local government associations, and then later on verified by the United Nations, in this case it's UNDP. So basically this is collective or joint effort that we started with Cities Alliance and with support of other United Nations agencies. So in the slide here, what we see, I already mentioned the objectives here, and we did for the first time in 2018 to assess if the legal institutional environment, including financial issues, is conducive to the localization of SDGs or post-2015 agenda. We also want to see whether there are certain mechanisms to implement and monitor SDGs with active participation of local governments, and also to compare, to look at the countries in the regions to identify which countries are currently better positioned to efficiently manage urbanization and use demographic change to catalyze faster and equitable national growth. And also among those Asia Pacific countries, and see basically to examine in selected countries in Asia Pacific the government initiatives to promote enabling environment for local governments to contribute in achieving the SDGs and post-2015 agenda, and identify areas for institutional reforms, like drawing lessons from the better rated countries to create a conducive environment for inclusive and sustainable urban development, including gender responsive governance. And the last objective here is to identify areas for reforms. I think this is the same as the previous one. So we, in the next slide, we actually applied 10 criteria. Actually, there are 12 criteria or indicators. These 10 criteria or 10 indicators have been used by UCLG Africa, and this is also we refer to their indicators as our benchmark and also used as a reference. But in Asia Pacific region, we added 2 indicators. Yeah? One is on environmental aspects, but these are basically in the 10 indicators that we have on the constitutional framework, legislative framework, also the democracy, as well as participation of citizen participation. So there are 10 indicators that have been used in Africa. And in Asia Pacific itself, with 30 Asia Pacific countries, actually we adopt a qualitative approach by assessing countries on scale from 1, less effective, to 4 most effective. And the indicators cover 5 areas: local governments, local capacity, financial autonomy, local efficiency, as well as national institutional framework. And these 5 areas covers the essential elements of city institutional environment within the context of decentralization and democracy. So on the next slides here, as I said earlier, we added 2 indicators, but on the indicator number 12, we didn't include here in analysis because it's a quite complex. This is more on the gender aspects, and this is something that we need to improve also in the next e-rating that we plan to do shortly. Next year is going to start. So basically replication in the works of Asia, looking at those 11 indicators in more than 30 countries. So here what the result, as you show in the next slide. Can we see the next slide, please? Yeah. So this is what I was referring. We have put 11 indicators, but the number 12 indicators on women we didn't include in this analysis because we found a bit complex here. So that we put here only 11 indicators looking at this what I mentioned, including the financial transfer from central to local governments. In the next slide, you could also see that the results so far. So if they have a higher score, like, that refers to the countries where the conducive environments are available, including those 11 indicators that I did mention. However, I just want to emphasize here that we're not evaluating the implementation of those indicators. What we do to see the the status in the country with regard to legislation, with regard to capacity development, fiscal transfer, and others. So here shown the result of total score by country on CEE criteria. And then in the next slide, you could see also that the result itself, that we have high performance of 13 countries that have score of more than 33, higher than 33. These have seen as the most favorable cities of local authorities in terms of legislations and adapted with evaluation laws of local autonomy. So it also has the most favorable environment for cities for instruments of transparency, accountability, public participation, capacity building, and national urban strategy. Bhutan has also scored highly, being leader of the sustainable development. And the second is high-performing countries that scores 28 to 32 points. This includes 12 countries. The legal frameworks and legislation of local government exist, serving the umbrella for delegation of power in governments. And decentralization also been functioning well for some years, enable local governments to manage their territories. Legal policy institutional reforms need still to be undertaken to ensure that the cities have the fiscal spaces and capacity capacities for function and delivering the SDGs. The second and the third level is moderate performing countries. 2 countries, Afghanistan and Bangladesh, fall in the range of these 20 to 27 points. And the countries in this are progressing towards the enabling environment for local government, but still require major reforms that compared to the other groups ranking. So they have implemented digitalization. Yes, some improvement are needed in some cases. And the last one is the lesser performing countries that less than 22 points, identify Pakistan here. So in the next slide, I just want to focus on the financial aspects here. And so this is when we look at the criteria itself, looking at this indicators, we see that urban strategy is quite low compared to others, and also we have a high transparency. When we talk about transparency, means rule regulations that enable for having transparency in the countries. So it's not about the level of transparency itself, but what existing policies, regulations, laws that show the aspect of transparency and capacity building for local governments, and also in terms of financial transfer from central to local governments and local democracy as well as constitution. So all quite good in terms of indicators themselves, but urban strategy is considered quite not very high. Next slide here show basically average criteria for criterion score across all countries. 5 criteria considered above 3. On financial transfer from central government related directly to constitutional arrangements for decentralization, administrative and fiscal responsibilities. There is also vertical fiscal imbalance between revenue collected by central and local governments. Local governments' revenue collection in many Asian Pacific countries is considered poor, but I'm sure it's going to be better because this EE rating was conducted in 2018, just before the COVID. So lack of comprehensive urban strategy is linked to poor planning and management of cities and lack of urban strategies. So here in the last slide and in the next slide, I'll show you the what can we, yeah. So we have analyzed only for Southeast Asia cases, financial transfer from central to local governments, and the criteria attempt to provide a performance measurements of financial transfer from central government to local government and their predictability. This is important to allowing local governments to make a better plan and use resources meaningfully. It's gone the poorest among overall and also in Southeast Asia. So this you can see that Thailand is considered high, also followed by Philippines, Indonesia. So in the next slide, this is my other remaining slides. So it's basically we see that weaknesses of fiscal decentralization is one of the primary factors explaining the performance of local governments. In the next slide here, in the slide here, no, sorry, just before the slide. So this important aspect maybe to explain here. Local governments often face several problems in financial matters. I think the PFC speaker really highlighted very well the situation in Asia Pacific. There is adequacy of local revenue and autonomy. Significant vertical fiscal imbalance still exists in some countries. In addition, income autonomy is also very low. In Indonesia and the Philippines, the central government still controls the tax scheme for property. There is also insufficient diversification of the local tax base, resulting in many tax distractions. So the centralization of tax object that should be decentralized in the region has a negative impact on the regional dependency. And the second aspect on expenditure management and service delivery, there is a lack of clarity in expenditure assignment is prevalent. This is more problem, like for example, in Thailand and also in appropriate expenditure assignment also be seen as a problematic. Another one is about budget discretion. Sufficient budget discretion is an issue also in some countries. We are talking only about Southeast Asian countries here. So the continued use of budget operation in some countries is a still problem, and prior approval and control of budgets by higher level authorities. This is also an important issue. And then last, intergovernment transfer throughout the region. I think entire region, and this last slide is about Southeast Asia. Heavy reliance and dependency on transfer and revenue sharing can be found. As this is also relevant with the funding from this SNG-WOFI, in which there is still high reliance on the government transfer. So there is lack of attention to fiscal imbalance and the design of equalization grants. And also complex conditional or specific transfer design are also found. And last is local government borrowing and investment finance. This is also still an issue. So local government success stories in Cambodia, Indonesia often have a poor or reliable access to credit. And this is also what we found. And also management capacity considered also quite inefficient in countries in Southeast Asia, but several reforms are underway. Hopefully in the next year, I think that we plan next year, we can have a better increase of enabling environment. So in conclusions, this is long conclusions. What we see here, most Asia Pacific countries have enabling a constitutional framework. For Indonesia, they all have legislation. You can do everything. You can even have municipal bond, but there is no one single bond released in this country, even though they are capable to do with the high credit rating worthiness. So many countries do not have strong enabling framework or local governments so that to generate their own local revenue. And LG capacity is an area that requires immediate reform and improvement. Improvement in knowledge, skills, and the usage of technology are also needed in financial infrastructure and organization management. And last, assessing this local government performance in Asia Pacific countries, more focus should be on the whether or not recommendations from a performance measurement audit are considered implemented. So this just one of the approach we want to see when we talk about enabling environment, and hopefully next year when we complete second round of enabling environment rating, we can see much better improvements. And again, this is just a simple approach that but further research need to be done to actually see whether whatever enabling environment available there with good legislation and also policies that are really implemented or not. So that's what I think I can share today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Banadia. It's very interesting. And it's actually a consistent message that the subnational government level, though there is in terms of legal institutional, legal framework is adequate. There is the issue of fiscal infrastructure, fiscal framework, and low government own source revenue. So that's a consistent message. So without much ado, let's move on to our next session. We have Mr. Nino Ramon B. Alvina, Executive Director of the Bureau of Local Government Finance of the Department of Finance in the Philippines. Thank you so much, Nino. Being in America, US at a very difficult time there, and still be awake and be present at this seminar. We are really grateful to you. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rashana. Good afternoon, everyone at ADB in Manila. Good morning to our colleagues at OECD in Paris. Thank you, ADB, for the invitation to talk about the topic and to share my views on country experience of the Philippines on fiscal decentralization. And this is a very important event of ADB, OECD, and UCLG as we promote the SNG-WOFI. So as Rashana mentioned, I'm currently wearing my hat here in the US as a Humphrey Fellow, and I'm very delighted to take on this topic and reflect on fiscal decentralization issues in my country and talk about my views on the importance of SNG, subnational government finance, and its implication on public service delivery. It's interesting to as mentioned by Bruno earlier, that we link subnational government finance to the SDGs, because most of the development issues are localized. As pointed out by Bruno, 169 of the targets have subnational relevance and linkages, and these SDG goals and targets have local nuances and contexts from country to country. So I've structured my presentation into 4 parts. I briefly talk about the nexus of SNG finance and public service delivery and its link to the SDGs. I'll share a brief profile and performance check of subnational governments in the Philippines. Later, I'll move on to the challenges and the opportunities and some takeaways and conclusions. So let me start with just a couple of underlining principles and operational dimensions of subnational government finance in my country. First of all, local finance is critical in the whole of government approach in nation building, and the central government in the Philippines considers all the 82 provinces, 147 cities, 1,487 municipalities, and more than 42,000 barangays or villages, including the regional government of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, or BARM, as partners in attaining our socio-economic development goals under a system of decentralization. In particular, the design mechanism is through fiscal decentralization, where later on I'll talk about the pillars, the 4 pillars of local finance that must have good foundations. And I refer to the revenue assignments, the expenditure responsibilities, the intergovernmental transfers, and credit financing as practiced in my country. All these are set in clear legal framework under the local autonomy provisions of our 1987 Constitution and the 1991 Local Government Code that provide the rules on how subnational governments operate and the financial mechanisms for public service delivery. So moving on to the next slide, when we talk of public service delivery, especially in a decentralized system, its quality is actually dependent or contingent on the ability for these local governments to fund the basic public goods and services. And it depends on one's fiscal capacity. While our experience shows that fiscal spaces increased from point X to point Y, the quality of spending among different levels of local governments varies, and we felt this more during the COVID-19 pandemic. As we plan for the fiscal space of the central government, local governments should be closely monitored and analyzed. In the Philippines, this is one of the fundamental functions of my office, the Bureau of Local Government Finance, as we aggregate the overall fiscal position of subnational governments. And that's why the initiative of OECD, UCLG, and together with ADB in setting up the SNG-WOFI allows for greater learning of innovations and practices on SNG finance across the globe. So the overall, I'd like to point out as well that the oversight functions of the central government in the Philippines through its agencies matter, such as the Department of Interior and Local Government that deals with home or interior affairs and capability building, the budget and management by the Department of Budget and Management, revenue generation and resource mobilization by the Finance Department and through the BLGF, socioeconomic planning by the National and Economic Development Authority, audit and accountability by the Commission on Audit, among many others. And this is done in partnership with the different leagues of local governments and their chief executives. But all these are not as meaningful as we want it to be if there are no collaborative arrangements, partnerships, and feedback mechanisms with stakeholders of subnational governments, such as the NGOs, the CSOs, the business sectors, the taxpayers, and the general public. Now, moving on, just on the 2 main pillars of fiscal decentralization and revenue assignments and expenditure responsibility. So from a macro level perspective, the quality of national and local fiscal governance, I think, matters in realizing our country goals and objectives, the SDG goals, and that's why I'm saying that SDGs and PFM are somehow inextricably linked, as the ability to achieve the targets depend not just on a country level commitments or leadership or governance, but more importantly on the financing side. And this is actually the core of the PFM, or the public finance cycle, of local planning, investment programming, resource mobilization, budgeting, expenditure management, and performance monitoring. And the cycle goes on with the SDGs at the core in all the different pillars of fiscal decentralization. Essentially, many dimensions of SDGs, as I have earlier mentioned, have local counterparts in the devolved basic services and functions, be it for health, agriculture, infrastructure, we name it. So for example, when we talk of SDG number 4 on the quality of education at the local level in my country, we know the important roles of local governments in supporting basic education through a local tax rider, which is the Special Education Fund, and I'll talk about it later on. Or we can talk about SDG number 7 on clean and affordable energy. And in the Philippines, we look at the local governments that benefit from the shares from a national wealth that could help them lower the cost of electricity. And as a final example, if we talk about SDG number 11, for sustainable and livable cities, we don't only talk about resiliency and disaster financing, but also talk about local infrastructure facilities that the subnational governments must provide. All these are within the country vision of the Philippines by 2040 for what we call matatag, maginhawa, at panatag na buhay, or strongly rooted, comfortable, and secure life. And development financing in the form of budget support or grants or transfers to the local governments will help actually catalyze the achievement of this vision, as well as the SDGs. So let me now move on to the different pillars. So part 2 of my discussion actually covers the first 2 pillars of revenue assignment and expenditure responsibilities. In the Philippines, our local governments have external and internal sources of revenues. External, including the constitutionally guaranteed just shares of local governments from national taxes in the forms of transfers, direct shares, and they can also tap grants, aids, borrowings, and loans, and venture into private-public partnership. Internally, local governments are authorized by law to impose local taxes with different tax bases, as summarized on the slide, including regulatory fees, user charges. They can generate business income from the operations of their economic enterprises, and it's there summarized on the screen. Now, comparatively, local governments have spending responsibilities for the devolved basic services, facilities that they must construct, and functions in different sectors such as health, agriculture, tourism, social services, environmental protection, among many others. So what have we seen? Next slide. What have we seen in the last 30 years? We've seen increased or improved local finance in the last 30 years, and the income of our local governments has grown significantly. Yes, revenues of local governments grew substantially, but these are not fully optimized yet. But we can show here from only 28 billion in 1992, local governments are now reporting 871 billion, or more than 30 times over in the period of 3 decades. In the chart, the local income to GDP ratios also significantly increased at 1.3% in 2021, and correspondingly with the tax and non-tax revenues. But as noted earlier in the summary presentation of OECD, this is our performance is still below the 1.5% ratio or mark, which is the average in most developing countries. But we also saw seasonality or drops in revenue performance during election years. In essence, operating income has outpaced the operating expenditures of local governments. Thus, we see absorptive capacity challenges, distributional equity of taxing powers, perhaps imbalance in expenditure functions, and the growth of surplus. Now, in the next slide, on the pillar of intergovernmental transfers, supporting local governments, we've seen increased transfers in the last 3 decades, starting off with a change in allocation of share. We've seen now central government transfers growing up to 40%, a share of national taxes under the Local Government Code of 1991, from only 724 million in 1972 to 15 billion in 1992, and this year 664 billion as transfers of the national government to our local governments. But dependency ratios, if you will notice on these transfers, has hardly changed over time, and we still see in aggregate levels that the average is 61 to 63%. If we look closely, this amount is good because of the offsetting effect of the rich, the big cities, but many local governments still have high to very high dependency on support from the national government. With the implementation of the Mandanas-Garcia ruling on the proper base and coverage of the base on which the shares of local governments are determined, the transfers have increased by 27 to 30% compared to the previous internal revenue allotments in 2021. Now, on the last pillar of fiscal decentralization, I'd like to talk briefly about credit financing. We've seen growing interest over time of local governments in tapping subnational borrowings to fund their priority development projects and other capital investment requirements. In the Philippines, all local governments are allowed to borrow subject to the limitations that we set according to their debt servicing capacity and their borrowing limits. So you will notice from 31 billion of outstanding loan in 2004, local governments now have an outstanding loan of 137 billion in 2021. But these subnational debts spread across multiple or many borrowing local governments are minimal, and these are within very manageable levels. The average debt servicing is only 3.6% of their income versus the statutory limit of 20%. GDP ratio is also below 0.8% of GDP, and only 21% of all the provinces, cities, and municipalities are borrowing, but this is substantially growing over time. The government financial institutions are predominantly providing the financing support, and the Office of the Department of Finance through the BLGF, together with the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, through its monetary board, ensure ex-ante compliance of local governments every time they borrow. Now, I'd like to talk about some challenges or opportunities in subnational government finance. From how I view it, and I'd like to start with number one, most of our subnational governments are not updating their tax bases, including the schedule of market values for property taxation. Many tax ordinances are updated when it comes to the rates for local taxes, for local business tax and other taxes, and the regulatory fees and user charges have also not been updated for quite some time, thus undermining revenue generation capacity and their ability to transition to full devolution. The second point that I want to mention is that mandatory local funds are somehow underutilized and not fully optimized. In the last 3 years, we've seen subnational governments utilizing only 71% of their local development fund. This is the 20% of the national transfers that they get, which are intended for capital investments. We also see 66% utilization of the Special Education Fund, or the SEF. This is the rider tax that I have mentioned earlier in my slide. The Local Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Fund for calamities, the utilization is at 52%. So these underutilization of local funds can be further improved. Now, when it comes to sectoral spending, I think they have not. They remain unchanged, and reforms could be introduced to drive development. We've noticed consistently high spending in general administration, 55%, modest in economic, 15%, and health services at 14%, social services at 9%, education services 4%, housing 2%, and 1% for debt, and labor at 0.5% labor services. Now, the fourth point is that the central government is also pursuing legislative measures to address all these concerns for them to improve local resource mobilization. And one of the main reform that we are pushing is the Real Property Assessment and Valuation Reform Act that will improve the system, the mechanisms, the standards, the tools used for real property valuation of local governments. And we are also pursuing other relevant policy reforms such as income classification and some amendments, hopefully in the local government code. Now, the fifth point that I'd like to make is that the central government has been supporting the financing requirements of the local governments through transfers, be it for their development goals, for SDGs, etc. Next year, the central government is allocating 820 billion in the national tax allotment budget, and this represents 15.6% of the total central government expenditure program for 2023, and some additional support fund for local governments are also being proposed for priority projects. Now, we see high income subnational governments having good fiscal space because of their growing surpluses, but other subnational governments need more support. I would also like to point out that information and communication tools and digitization are needed to be introduced at the subnational governance mechanisms for especially in local fiscal management, for efficient, responsive revenue generation and tax collection system. Despite the high demand and new business models, we noted that only 7% of our local governments are using information and communications technologies for electronic payment and collection system at the local level. That's why our Secretary of Finance is looking into the digitization approach that local governments should pursue to improve the quality of treasury assessment and fiscal management practices at the provincial, city, and municipal levels. And finally, capital investment planning and budgeting can still be improved, and we have the rich metropolitan cities, subnational governments that should be considering investments in big ticket items that are linked in LGU infrastructure requirements through non-traditional financing modes, perhaps through bonds, through tax increment financing, through transit-oriented development, among others, that promote greater transportation and people-to-people connectivity, build resilient communities, create jobs, and sustain the infrastructure requirements of the locality. Now, as In conclusion, I'd like to share some thoughts and takeaways. Number one, the must-haves of good public financial management and subnational government finance should revolve around standards, systems, people, and practice. And these are important to provide, as mentioned earlier by our speakers, a good enabling environment wherein central government and subnational government coordination and support can be further strengthened to improve the quality of our public goods and services. The second point is that domestic resource mobilization strategies must build local revenue autonomy. The toolkits, as I have shared to you using the 4 pillars, are available. Subnational governments should be supported to build their capacity in exercising their mandates towards financing local development priorities and, of course, the SDGs. And the next point is that I'd like to make is that fiscal decentralization is a continuum, and data-driven reforms are necessary to respond to national priorities. National priorities meet the goals and objectives and enhance the subnational government landscape to effectively transition to full devolution as per the local government code. And lastly, we must sustain subnational finance data aggregation, and the results are important. They matter. Monitoring and evaluation, needless to say, cut across the pillars of fiscal decentralization, and it's important that we have reliable, timely data to contribute to better planning, good policies, responsive budgeting, prudent spending, and accountable subnational government leadership. So that's all for my presentation. Thank you very much. Salamat po. Over to you, Roshana.
Thank you so much, Nino. This is really interesting. I'm sorry that we are running out of time, but I mean, it's very fascinating to hear how Philippines is doing in terms of subnational government and finance. And it's encouraging to see that things are improving. And then you have also identified some of the reform areas, which actually is, again, consistent with what we heard from the previous speakers in SNG-WOFI and also Dr. Barnadia's creating enabling environment. We do not have much time, but I would be very happy to take a couple of maybe 2 or 3 questions if there are, and then we can move to the closing. I think we can speak directly here. So if you have any questions, please, you can maybe raise your hand or speak directly, and please, tell to whom the question is. So do we have any questions? Right. I think there are no questions. Yeah. Well, actually, if you have any questions, because many people asked if we have the presentations, we can share these documents with the participants. And if there are no questions, we can move to the closing. Then we'll be on time to close this webinar. So maybe I'll call upon Hiranya Mukhopadhyay, our Chief of Governance Thematic Group of ADB, for his remarks. Please, Hiranya.
Yes, thank you, Rachana. Distinguished speakers, dear colleagues from the OECD and ADB, and dear participants. Today we learned some important aspects and interesting findings on subnational finance and investment, which is undoubtedly one of the key development priorities in filling the huge infrastructure gaps and improving quality, inclusivity, and efficiency of public service delivery, and thereby contribute to the local economic development and meeting the sustainable development goals. I'd like to thank all the eminent speakers today who enlightened us with the finances and investment situation in Asia, issues and challenges of cities, and interesting case of Philippines. Challenges are enormous, no doubt about that, but we know where the problems lie and how to address them. The World Observatory of Subnational Government Finance and Investment Surveys and the Cities Enabling Environment Rating not only enlighten us on the reality, but also guide us and make us think critically and strategically to improve the situation. Country examples like the one we heard from Mr. Nino on Philippines are so powerful to link theories to practices. They demonstrate what it is like to implement reforms, how it could be done, and the significance of reforms and required technical support. As DG Carrasco emphasized in his opening remarks, creating an enabling environment to increase subnational finance and investment is critical, and this calls for partnerships within and outside the countries at all levels and among development partners. I am pleased to note the strong collaboration ADB has with OECD and UCLG in these important areas. As subnational governments face this urgent and critical needs to increase their funding and financing to fill the infrastructure deficits and improve quality public services, they need to pay adequate attention to enhance their institutional capacity, improve public financial management systems and fiscal discipline, and increase transparency and accountability, as this will increase their creditworthiness, which, as you all know, is very important to attract private investment, commercial financing, and which is not only desirable, but earnestly required to meet the investment needs and achieve the development objectives. Our partnership with OECD in multi-level governance was formalized through a knowledge partnership agreement last year, which enabled us to undertake several important initiatives together. And we are pleased to be one of the partners in the 3rd edition of the World Observatory of Subnational Government Finance and Investment, of course, led by OECD and UCLG. I'm also grateful to UCLG ASPAC for the great collaboration in pursuing the work on localization of sustainable development goals. Your technical inputs in this area are noteworthy. We'd like to continue our partnerships with OECD and UCLG to take forward this important agenda of subnational finance and investment, as well as the localization of SDGs. Before handing over to my colleague, Ms. Isabel Chatri from the OECD, I would like to thank once again to all the distinguished speakers and participants for their excellent contributions to the webinar. I would also like to thank the organizing team and event management team for the great job. I hope there will be more such events in the future to share knowledge. Thank you very much and have a pleasant day or evening.
Thank you so much, Hiranya. So now, without much ado, I would like to call Ms. Isabel Chatri, Head of Unit Decentralization, Subnational Finance and Infrastructure Unit at the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities. Over to you, Isabel, for the final remark.
Thank you very much, Rachana and Hiranya. So I will be very brief. So let me start by also thanking our speakers and all of you for joining us today. I want to particularly thank ADB and Bruno and Rachana for their excellent collaboration on this project, and more broadly in the framework of the OECD UCLG World Observatory on Subnational Government and Finance and Investment, so SNG-WOFI, it's shorter. I would like also to thank all the ADB country experts, as well as national governments such as the Philippines, who reviewed the country profiles. It was really extremely useful. So as was mentioned several times during the webinar, some national governments face several challenges in fully assuming their roles in achieving the SDGs and other goals, including climate objectives. These challenges are diverse. They can be institutional, political, financial, or related to capacities at some national level. So it was clearly mentioned today, and also very well highlighted by Bernardia and Nino in their presentations. So with the new report on the multi-level governance and finance in the Asia-Pacific region, we draw initial lessons and avenues for national governments, international organizations, development banks, and partners to support some national government in the face of these challenges, and to optimize their contribution to economic and social development in Asia and the Pacific and the SDGs. However, we also saw that there is still a lot of room for improvement in data collections, but also in in-depth analysis and refining solid policy recommendations for the region. Many issues and policy opportunities are revealed by the report and also by the presentation that are worth exploring further, such as improving fiscal frameworks for subnational government, in particular the mobilization of own revenue sources, but also improving the access to external financing, improving institutional capacity, improving also approaches for financing of climate actions at the subnational level, and just to mention a few. So we look forward to receiving your ideas and feedback on these topics and other ideas for effective multi-level governance in the region. So looking forward, we hope to be able to continue this work as part of the next edition of the World Observatory in 2 or 3 years. But of course, and more immediately, also looking at more specific key topics and work in the Asia-Pacific regions. And we will be happy to explore in more details the processes in action in the regions to make multi-level governance system work better in Asia and the Pacifics. So thanks again to ADB. Thanks also to the OECD team, Courtney, Michael, and Charlotte for the great work on the OECD reports. Thanks also to our colleagues from UCLG. And now I will now leave the floor to Rachana to end this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you, everyone. I mean, we can close this now on time, actually, since there were no questions. We could close it on time, but definitely a very insightful lot of learning from the 3 presentations. So I thank you so much. We are really grateful for your time, efforts, and your presentation. And definitely, we need to all work together for improving the multi-level governance and supporting our subnational governments. So thank you so much. We'll be working together. Okay, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.